Good morning. We're going to start a unit here. When I taught English class, this was a big unit, but we're going to have to cut it down a little bit because we don't have very much time. But man, it's been a long time, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I did a study, a week-long study at Gettysburg. And so I really have a love for Gettysburg. I learned a lot about the Gettysburg Address. And so I wanted to share this with you, the importance of this time and the importance of the Gettysburg Address. The Gettysburg Address is not a long thing. There are actually 5 different copies of it because when you give a speech, you don't say it word for word what is on the paper. So there is the copy of what it said on the paper. There was a man taking shorthand. Shorthand is this old-fashioned thing before they had like microphones and stuff, and it was a certain type of writing system. And so he took notes. So he wrote down exactly word for word what Lincoln said, and that was published in the New York Times the next day. And then people asked Lincoln for copies. So I think there are a total of 4 or 5 copies that are actually in Lincoln's hand. So Lincoln was asked to come to Gettysburg to give, he had 2.5 minutes to give, or he wasn't the main speaker. So the Gettysburg Address was 2.5 minutes, 272 words. He was asked to give a few appropriate remarks, but these are words that are never to be forgotten. So there's a lot you can learn about the Civil War and its battles and people and causes. But the purpose of this lesson is to just talk about the Gettysburg Address. But you need to understand a little bit. I see my faces in front of the date. It was November 19th, 1863. So what made these 272 words great? He did, how did he say everything he needed to say in less than 3 minutes? And why are we still looking at it today? So here was the setting. The Battle of Gettysburg was one of the worst in the history. Next year you'll study that with Mr. Withrow more in depth. We've spent some time in class doing that in the past, but we just don't have time. But you might want to look into some of the details of the Civil War. It happened July 1863. The battle was 3 days long, actually. There was not an original intention of battling here. Lee's army was coming up. They had won a lot of battles and thought if they came up into Pennsylvania, into the Union, that they would win the war. And so they actually kind of needed supplies. There was a big arsenal at Harrisburg, and they were going to get more ammunition and more supplies. And Gettysburg actually has, I believe, 10 roads into it. So it's kind of a bunch of roads converge on Gettysburg. And they accidentally ran into each other on the way. And that's why the battle ended up being fought there. So these were some of the deadliest series of battles in the Civil War. There were these many casualties for the Union, these many casualties for the Confederates. But when you consider it all, they were all Americans. And so that's why this is considered the worst loss of any war, because everybody who died in this war was an American. So 5 months after the battles of Gettysburg, or the battle at Gettysburg, the National Cemetery at Gettysburg was being dedicated. And so there was this famous orator that was coming. I guess they were kind of the rock stars of the day. So he was coming, and Lincoln was just kind of tagged on the end. And this was the note he got. I'm sorry, my face is in it. If you want to watch this without my face in it, you can. But he was asked to give a few appropriate remarks, kind of like the amen. This was the main guy. This guy spoke for 2 hours using over 13,000 words. And I put the bored baby there because I could not listen to somebody talk for 2 hours. I do not have that kind of attention span. Maybe people back then. But then it was time for Abraham Lincoln to give a few appropriate remarks. If you go on the module, there is a really phenomenal video of the speech. You'll have to watch it more than once. It's really good. It's only 2.5 minutes long, but I had to use a URL to put that on, so you can watch that video later. It's supposed to be right here, but long story. Okay. So anyhow, this is the speech, and after you've listened to it, I'm not going to read it to you. fourscore and 7 years ago, a score is 20 years. And so if you think about this, in other words, this is 1863. And if you look up here, 1776. 1776 plus 87. So you can see that he is totally referring here to the Declaration of Independence. So he talks about that was the past of the nation. Here he talks about the present, what's going on. We're engaged in a great civil war. And then he talks about the people who died there. And, we can talk all we want, but the people who shed their blood there, they are the ones that dedicated and consecrated and made the ground holy. And you can still go to this cemetery and you can see where he spoke. Actually, when I did my study, they said that where they say he spoke was not really where he spoke. It was actually in a different place, but I'd have to show you, and we're not in Gettysburg. This is a real ironic phrase. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And of course, we do remember what they did, and we are thankful that the slaves were freed and that our country stayed unified. But he said that nobody would remember what he said here, and everybody remembers what he said here. So that's a really ironic statement. So then he talks about the future. What are we going to do? These people died here. Are we just going to sit here and sulk, or are we going to do something? And he says we've got to dedicate ourselves to the unfinished work that they have started here, and that we can save our nation, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Our country was called the Great Experiment. Other countries have been ruled by dictators and kings and monarchs, but this nation was founded on, can the people run their country? And if that's one reason why it's called a democratic republic rather than just a democracy, because there is a thing called anarchy, and if just the majority of the people take over, that isn't always good for everybody. And so there are checks and balances in our system to keep it being run over by crazy people. So who is the audience there? There were soldiers, there were army, widows, and orphans, people who had lost their husband there, people who had lost their dad there, people who had lost their brother there. There were congressmen, governors, important statespeople, townspeople, college students, reporters. So we talk about tone and mood. His tone, how he spoke, had to reflect the mood of the era. It was a sad area, but he also had to give them hope. These people needed hope. And so he did it just right. He had to establish the mood through the words he chose to establish that tone. He didn't use powerful words or fancy words. The entire speech is 272 words, and 190 of the words are single syllable, and there are only four-syllable words. So we should be able to understand what he's saying. Lincoln's language had to sound intelligent because there were these important people there, but he wanted to speak in the vernacular, the daily language of the common people, because those were the ones who had really sacrificed so much. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. These are some notes. When I was in Gettysburg, I took pictures of these, and it talks about the passion with which Lincoln spoke. And this PowerPoint is on my website. You can go through and study this a little more closely. Lincoln was intelligent and educated, but he never forgot his humble beginning. You know, he pretty much taught himself. He had very little schooling, and he cared about learning, and so he got books and taught himself, and later on went to law school. His voice demonstrated his brilliance, but he showed his humility. I think Lincoln had a real way of doing that, showing humility, but yet in a very intelligent way. Lincoln did not compose the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope during a train ride to Gettysburg. I hate to break this to you, but that is not true. Actually, he had the entire speech written on a White House document. So he began formulating his thoughts as early as right after the Battle of Gettysburg, July 7th, he stated. And so you can see that this speech that he gave on that day has some similarities. He knew what he wanted to say, but the craft was figuring out how to best to say it. He divided into 1, 2, 3 parts, past, present, future. You can read through that on your own time. And he chose quotes from the Declaration of Independence. They were well known, they were patriotic, the whole audience would understand them, and they were appropriate to the slave issue, and they brought forth emotions. In that day, people were very familiar with the Bible too, and so he used some quotes from some wording from the Bible. Brought forth in Luke 2:7, brought forth her firstborn son. This would have been in what was called the King James Bible, which would have been the Bible of the day. And he said, our forefathers brought forth. He used 70 years and 10, which is in Psalm 90. He said 70 years. He used the word hallowed, which everybody memorized the Lord's Prayer back then. Maybe some of you even know the Lord's Prayer. So he used that word hallowed. And then he used the word perish, which is probably the other verse that if you know any Bible, you probably know John 3:16. So that would have been very familiar to the people. So even though Lincoln did not write the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on the train to Gettysburg, he actually did revise his speech. When he got to Gettysburg and he saw the horror there and what had happened there, he actually took his speech, and it had been folded in half to stick in his hat, probably. He used to carry things in his hat. And so he ripped it along the fold, and he changed the entire bottom of the speech. He actually met with Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and they were together for about an hour. And one of the clues that Stanton might have influenced what he said is Lincoln had never used the word perish in a speech before, and Stanton used it all the time. So maybe he had that influence, using the word shall not perish from the earth. So it was the right speech at the right time by the right person. 272 words, never to be forgotten. So look over this PowerPoint on your own. I kind of went through it and gave you a few little details that I know from my study at Gettysburg. And hopefully you will understand a little better. There are going to be 2 quizzes. One you can take today. It's on the content of the Gettysburg Address. And then the second will be on some of the details on this video. So I hope you enjoyed it.